The full moon lit up the narrow bush path as Adira walked quickly through the night. Her parents were asleep at home, not knowing she had sneaked out to meet her boyfriend Deo by the village river. The sounds of night creatures followed her steps. Then she saw it, a wooden chair sitting alone in the middle of the path. Strange, Idara thought, slowing her steps. The chair shouldn't be there. Nobody left furniture on the bush paths. Something about the chair made Idara stop. Moonlight revealed strange carvings covering its dark wood. Faces, animals, and symbols she didn't understand twisted across its surface. Common sense told her to walk around it and continue on her way. But the chair seemed to call to her. I'll just look at it for a moment, she told herself, stepping closer. The night went silent as she approached. No insects chirped. No leaves rustled. Just the sound of her breathing and her heartbeat in her ears. Her fingers traced one of the carvings, a face that seemed to be crying. The wood felt warm under her touch, almost alive. I shouldn't sit, she whispered to herself. But even as the thought formed, her body began to lower onto the seat. The moment she sat down, Idara knew she had made a terrible mistake. The chair grabbed her like invisible hands were holding her in place. She tried to stand, but her body wouldn't obey. Fear rushed through her like cold water. Help! She screamed, but her voice seemed to disappear into the night. Someone help me. The world around her began to change. The trees, the path, the moonlight, all of it faded away. Bright light poured in from everywhere and nowhere at once. And then, the chair was gone. But so was her village. Idara stood alone in a strange place she had never seen before. The sky was too bright. The ground under her feet didn't feel right. Far away in the village, Idara's mother turned in her sleep, feeling something was wrong, but not knowing what. Her father, still weak from his stroke, dreamed of his daughter walking a dangerous path. Neither knew that Idara's stubbornness had finally taken her somewhere she couldn't easily return from. In this strange new place, Idara's journey was just beginning. Years of not listening, of doing exactly what she was told not to do, had finally caught up with her. And this time, the price would be higher than she ever imagined. The village knew Idara long before she knew herself. That one has a mind like stone, the elders would whisper when she passed. Nothing gets in, and nothing comes out changed. Idara's father, Ikong, was a respected man who had worked hard all his life. His hands were rough from years of farming, his face lined with the wisdom of someone who had learned life's lessons the hard way. When he spoke, people listened, everyone except his daughter. Adara, he would say, placing his large hand on her shoulder, listen to me. The world is not always kind to those who refuse to bend, but Adara would only roll her eyes when he turned away. She was 16 now, too old for her father's endless warnings and rules. What did he know about being young today? His stories about respecting elders and following traditions bored her. Her mother, Amma, tried a different approach. Where Ekong was firm like an oak tree, Amma was gentle like flowing water, trying to shape her daughter through love and patience. My child, she would say while braiding Idara's hair, stubbornness is like carrying a heavy stone everywhere you go. Sooner or later, your arms will tire. Idara loved her mother, but found her equally frustrating. You don't understand, Mama. Times are different now. Amma's eyes would fill with a sadness that Idara was too young to recognize as fear. She had seen other village children walk the path of rebellion. Some never returned to themselves. The day everything changed began like any other. The morning sun filtered through the small window of their mud house, casting long shadows across the dirt floor. Ekong had been feeling unwell for days, but on this particular morning, he could barely rise from his sleeping mat. Idara, he called weakly, come here. Idara stood in the doorway, already dressed to meet Bolu, the boy her father had forbidden her to see. Bolu was older, with a motorcycle and stories about the big city. He made Idara feel special, grown up. I cannot today, father. I promised to help Erit with her chores. The lie came easily to her lips. Akong's eyes narrowed. He knew his daughter well enough to see through her words, but he was too weak to argue. I need your help today, daughter. I have fallen ill. Guilt flickered briefly across Idara's face, quickly replaced by impatience. She glanced toward the door, already imagining Bulu waiting for her by the old baobab tree. What do you need? She asked, not moving from the doorway. Alma entered then, carrying a bowl of water. She looked at her daughter with disappointment. Your father is sick, Idara. Can you not see? He needs rest. And there is a package that must be delivered today. Why can't you take it? Idara challenged. I must stay and care for your father, Alma replied, her voice steady, but her eyes flashing with rare anger. Is it too much to ask that you help your family for once instead of running off to who knows where? Something in her mother's tone made Idara step into the room. She looked properly at her father and saw the sheen of sweat on his forehead, the unusual pallor of his skin. For a moment, concern pushed through her self-absorption. What package? She asked softer now. Ikong pointed to a small wooden box on the table. It must go to Elder Effiong on the other side of the village. It is very important. He paused, gathering strength. Take the long path around the village. Do not go through the bush path by the market. The bush path is faster. I could be there and back in half the time. Idar argued. No. The force of Akong's voice surprised everyone, sending him into a fit of coughing. When he recovered, he spoke more quietly. The bush path is dangerous. There have been thieves. Promise me you will take the long path. Idar sighed dramatically. Fine. I promise. Neither Ekong nor Alma missed the insincerity in their daughter's voice, but they had no choice but to trust her. They did not know that this simple task would set in motion events that would change their daughter forever. They could not see the chair waiting on the bush path, or the thieves, or the tears that would come. They could only hope that somehow, something would finally reach the heart of their stubborn daughter. As Adara took the box, neither she nor her parents realized that everything Akong had worked for in his life was inside it. His savings, his legacy, their future. And Adara was already planning to break her promise, thinking only of the quickest way to finish this errand so she could meet Bolu. Outside, the village continued its day, unaware of the small drama unfolding in one humble home. Birds sang, children played, and somewhere, the path through the bush waited for a girl who never listened, who always thought she knew better, who was about to learn the hardest lesson of all. The wooden box felt heavier in Idara's hands than it should have. She walked slowly away from her home, turning the corner before glancing back. No one was watching. With a small smile, she changed direction, heading straight for the bush path her father had forbidden. It will save me an hour, she reasoned to herself. What father doesn't know won't hurt him. The sun beat down on the narrow dirt path as Idara hurried along. Birds called to each other in the trees above, and somewhere in the distance, a goat bleated. Idara's mind was not on her surroundings, but on Bolu. She imagined his smile when she told him how clever she had been, taking the shortcut despite her father's warning. She did not see the three young men until they stepped onto the path in front of her. Well, what do we have here? The tallest one grinned, revealing a missing front tooth. A girl all alone with a pretty box. Fear shot through Ida's body like lightning. She clutched the box tighter and took a step back. Leave me alone, she said, trying to sound brave. This belongs to Elder Effiong. The men laughed. Even better, said another, his eyes never leaving the box. The old man must have something valuable in there. Idara turned to run, but the third man had already moved behind her. She was trapped. Give us the box, girl, and you can go home to your mama, the first man said, holding out his hand. No, Idara shouted, remembering the seriousness in her father's eyes. For the first time, She wished she had listened to him. What happened next was quick and brutal. A rough hand grabbed her arm. Another snatched at the box. Idara fought, kicking and screaming. But she was one small girl against three grown men. A hard shove sent her tumbling to the ground. By the time she looked up, the men were running away, the precious box clutched in their hands. Stop, please, she cried, scrambling to her feet and running after them. But they were too fast, disappearing into the thick bush like shadows. Idara stood alone on the path, her heart pounding, tears streaming down her face. Her dress was torn, and her knees were scraped and bleeding. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the heavy feeling in her chest. She had failed. She had disobeyed. And now something terrible had happened. Across the village, in their small home, Ekong suddenly sat up in his sickbed. A sharp pain gripped his chest, as if something precious had been torn away from him. What is it? Amma asked, rushing to his side. I don't know, he whispered, his hand over his heart. But I fear for our daughter. The walk home was the longest of Idara's life. Each step felt heavier than the last as she rehearsed what she would tell her parents. Maybe she could lie, say she was attacked on the long path, but as she approached her home, she knew she could not add another lie to her mistake. The sound of wailing reached her before she opened the door. Inside, neighbors crowded around her father's sleeping mat. Her mother looked up as she entered, her face streaked with tears. What happened? Idara asked, her voice small. Your father, Amma said, her eyes accusing even through her tears. He has had a stroke. He cannot move his right side. He cannot speak. Idara pushed through the neighbors to see her father. Ikon lay still, his face drooping on one side, his right arm limp beside him. But his eyes were open, and when they found Idara, they asked the question his lips could not form. The box is gone, Idara admitted, falling to her knees beside him. I took the bush path. There were thieves. They took it. I'm sorry, father. I'm so sorry. A tear rolled from the corner of Akong's eye. He tried to speak, but only garbled sounds came out. Amma let out a cry of anguish and grabbed Idara's shoulders. Do you know what was in that box? She demanded. Everything. Everything your father has worked for his entire life. All our savings. The deed to our land. Everything to secure our future. The room spun around Idara. She had not known. She had thought it was just some ordinary delivery. How could she have known that her simple act of disobedience would cost them everything? I didn't know, she whispered. You didn't need to know. Alma's voice rose with her grief. You only needed to listen. Just once in your life, you needed to listen. The neighbors looked away, uncomfortable witnesses to the family's pain. Some shook their heads. They had all seen this coming. The stubborn girl. The girl who never listened. Now look what had happened. That night, as her father lay fighting for his life, and her mother sat beside him, refusing to look at her daughter, Idara huddled in the corner of their home. The weight of what she had done pressed down on her chest until she could barely breathe. I will change, she promised silently to the night. I will listen. I will help. I will make this right. But even as these thoughts formed, another part of her mind was already rebelling. It wasn't entirely her fault, was it? Her father should have told her what was in the box. The thieves were the real villains here. Why should she bear all the blame? And so, even in the face of disaster, Idara's stubborn heart remained unchanged. She did not know that fate was not finished teaching her its harsh lesson. She did not know that a strange chair would soon be waiting for her on another forbidden path. She did not know that the heaviest burdens are the ones we create ourselves. The village slept under a blanket of stars, unaware that the worst was yet to come for the girl who refused to learn. 3 weeks passed. Ekong remained bedridden, able to speak only in broken words and move only his left side. The village doctor visited daily, but always left shaking his head. Without money for proper medicine, There was little hope for improvement. Alma aged a decade in those 3 weeks. She moved through their home like a ghost, caring for her husband, cooking meals no one ate, and watching her daughter with tired, disappointed eyes. Why? She asked Idara one evening as they sat in the dim light of a single candle. Why can you never listen? Idara had no answer. She felt terrible about what had happened to her father, but a stubborn voice inside her still whispered that it wasn't entirely her fault. During those weeks, Bolu had not come to see her. Idara had sent messages through other village children, but he seemed to have disappeared. The loneliness pressed down on her, making it hard to breathe in the small house filled with her father's labored breathing and her mother's silent accusations. Then one evening, a young boy brought her a message. Meet me by the river at midnight. I miss you. Deo, not Bolu. The boy who had been pursuing her before she chose Bolu instead. Idora read the note twice, confusion mixing with a small thrill of excitement. Someone still wanted to see her. Someone still cared. That night, as her parents slept, Idora lay awake, listening to the sounds of the night through their small window. Her mother's warnings echoed in her mind. Never go out after dark. The night belongs to spirits and those who wish us harm. But the thought of sitting by the river with Deo, of escaping the heavy silence of her home even for an hour, was too tempting to resist. Just this once, she whispered to herself. I'll be careful. I'll come right back. No one will know. The moon was high when Idara slipped from her sleeping mat. She paused by her father's side, watching the slow rise and fall of his chest. For a moment, guilt tugged at her heart. I'm sorry, she mouthed silently, then turned away. Outside, the village was silent except for the occasional bark of a dog or call of a night bird. Idora moved quickly through the shadows, her heart pounding in her chest. The path to the river lay before her, but taking it would mean walking past Elder Muse's home. The old man rarely slept and would certainly see her. The bush path is faster anyway, she reasoned, turning toward the forbidden route, the same path where the thieves had attacked her. The night air felt cool against her skin as she entered the dense bush. Moonlight filtered through the leaves, creating patches of silver on the dirt path. Idara walked quickly, trying not to think about what had happened the last time she took this route. Then she saw it, a wooden chair sitting in the middle of the path. Idara stopped. The chair hadn't been there earlier in the day, she was certain of it. Who would leave a chair on a bush path? Something about it made her uneasy. The wood was dark, almost black, and covered with strange carvings that seemed to shift in the moonlight. Faces appeared and disappeared as she stared, some smiling, others twisted in pain. I should go around it, Idara thought, but her feet were already moving toward the chair, as if pulled by an invisible force. In the small house across the village, Alma sat up suddenly, her heart racing. She looked at the sleeping mat where her daughter should be and found it empty. Idara, she called, her voice trembling. When no answer came, she knew. Her stubborn daughter had gone out into the night, despite all warnings. Akong stirred in his sleep, murmuring something that sounded like chair through his damaged speech. Back on the path, Idara now stood before the strange chair. A voice in her head screamed at her to turn back, to run home, but her hand reached out of its own accord to touch the carved wood. It felt warm under her fingers, almost alive. The carving seemed to pulse with an inner light, and somewhere deep in her mind, Idara heard whispers, too faint to understand, but somehow familiar. I should not sit, she told herself firmly. But even as the thought formed, her body was already lowering onto the seat. The moment she made contact with the chair, Idara knew she had made a terrible mistake. A cold sensation shot through her body, and she tried to stand, but found she couldn't move. It was as if invisible hands held her in place. Help! She tried to call, but no sound came from her lips. The world around her began to spin. trees and moon and stars blurring together in a dizzying whirl of light and shadow. Then, just as suddenly, everything stopped. The chair was gone, and Idara found herself standing in a place she had never seen before. The sky above was not the star-filled darkness of her village night, but a strange, bright expanse that was neither day nor night. The path beneath her feet was no longer dirt, but seemed made of some shimmering material that changed color with each step she took. In the distance, strange shapes rose against the horizon, not trees or buildings, but forms that seemed to shift and change as she looked at them. Fear gripped Idara's heart. "Where am I?" she whispered, and this time her voice worked, though it sounded different, as if coming from very far away. No answer came, only the soft whisper of a breeze that carried unfamiliar scents and sounds. Idara turned in a circle, looking for some sign of home, of anything familiar, but found nothing. She was alone in this strange place. Her stubbornness, her refusal to listen, had finally taken her somewhere she could not simply talk her way out of. For the first time in her young life, Idara felt truly afraid. Not the momentary fear of being caught in a lie or facing her parents' anger, but a deep, soul-shaking terror that comes from being utterly lost. As this realization washed over her, something heavy suddenly appeared on her head. Reaching up, Idara felt a basket, large and weighty, balanced precariously on her crown. When she tried to remove it, her hands passed through it as if it were made of smoke. Yet the weight remained, pressing down on her, forcing her to stand straight to keep it balanced. "Welcome," said a voice behind her, "to the land of the familiar." Idara turned to see a girl about her age, also carrying a heavy basket on her head. The girl's eyes held a sadness beyond her years, and when she smiled, it did not reach those eyes. "My name is Simi," the girl said, "and you have much to learn." Miles away, in their small village home, Alma wept beside her husband's bed. Something told her that her daughter was gone, not just from their home, but from their world. Akong reached for his wife's hand with his good arm, tears streaming down his half-paralyzed face. Without words, they shared their fear that this time, their stubborn daughter had gone somewhere from which she might never return. "The land of the familiar," Idira repeated, her neck already aching from the invisible basket's weight. "What is this place? Why can't I take this basket off my head?" Simi's eyes softened with understanding. She had once been just as confused and frightened when she first arrived. "This is where the stubborn come to learn," she explained, adjusting her own basket with practiced ease. "The basket you carry is the weight of your actions. Every time you refuse to listen, every person you hurt with your stubbornness, every consequence you ignored." Idara tried again to lift the basket, but her hands passed through it as if it were made of mist. Yet the weight remained, solid and unyielding. "Everyone here carries their own burden," Simi continued, gesturing to the strange landscape around them. For the first time, Idara noticed other figures in the distance: men, women, and children, all walking slowly with baskets balanced on their heads. Some baskets were so heavy their carriers were bent nearly double. Others were lighter, allowing their bearers to move more freely. "How long have you been here?" Idara asked, wondering how the girl could speak so calmly about their situation. "Time works differently here," Simi replied. "In your world, I've been missing for 3 years. My mother probably thinks I'm dead by now." Her voice cracked slightly before she regained her composure. "I was 14 when I sat on the chair. I refused to listen to my grandmother about the dangers of swimming in the river during the rainy season. My little brother followed me in." She stopped, unable to finish. Something in Ida's chest tightened. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Simi shook her head. "Your basket will get heavier if we stand still. We must keep moving." As they walked, the landscape shifted around them, sometimes appearing as a vast desert, other times as a dense forest, never staying the same for long. The only constants were the bright, timeless sky, and the shimmering path beneath their feet. Why is it called the land of the familiar? Idara asked, struggling to keep pace with Simi while balancing her burden. Because everything here is familiar to you in some way, Simi explained. This world shapes itself from your memories and the consequences of your actions. The things you see will reflect what you've done or what you fear. As if responding to Simi's words, the path ahead suddenly transformed into a scene from Idara's village, the market where she had often disobeyed her parents by lingering too long, talking to boys they had warned her against. It's not real, Simi cautioned as Idara reached toward a familiar fruit stall. Just memories and lessons. The market scene faded, replaced by an empty field. Idara felt her basket grow suddenly heavier, causing her to stumble. Why did it get heavier? She asked, struggling to straighten up. Your thoughts, Simi said. When you think of your mistakes without truly understanding them, the weight increases. That's not fair, Idara protested. How can my thoughts make it heavier? Simi gave her a look that reminded Idara of her mother, patient but firm. The basket is your burden. It responds to you, not to any rules of fairness. They walked in silence for a while, Idara trying to adjust to the weight pressing down on her head and shoulders. She noticed that Simi's basket, while still substantial, seemed lighter than her own. Why is your basket lighter than mine? She finally asked. I've learned some lessons, Simi replied simply. Each time you truly understand the consequences of your stubbornness, the burden lightens a little. In the distance, a figure caught Idara's attention. A tall, slender woman whose basket was so light it appeared to be floating above her head rather than weighing her down. Who is that? Idara asked. Someone who has almost learned enough to leave, Simi said, a hint of envy in her voice. Few make it that far. Most of us remain trapped here, unable to fully understand or accept the consequences of our actions. Trapped? Forever? Panic edged into Idara's voice. How do we get back home? Simi stopped walking and turned to face her. That's the hardest part. No one knows exactly. People disappear sometimes. We assume they've learned whatever lesson they needed to learn and return to their world. But they never tell anyone they're leaving. One day they're here, the next they're gone. So we're just supposed to walk around with baskets on our heads until we magically understand some lesson? Idara's old stubbornness flared. That's stupid. I want to go home now. The moment the words left her mouth, her basket doubled in weight, nearly driving her to her knees. Idara cried out in pain and shock. The first rule, Simi said, helping her regain her balance, is never reject the lesson. It only makes the burden heavier. Tears of frustration welled in Idara's eyes. I didn't ask for this. I didn't know sitting on that chair would bring me here. None of us did, Simi said softly. But we were all warned about something, weren't we? We all chose to ignore those warnings. Idara fell silent, remembering her parents' countless admonitions. Don't take the bush path. Don't go out at night. Listen to your elders. Always the same message. Listen, obey, respect. And always the same response from her. Defiance. There's something else you should know, Simi continued, her voice becoming urgent. Never, under any circumstances, let your basket fall. If it touches the ground, you'll be trapped here forever. As if to illustrate her point, she gestured to a figure in the distance, an old man standing completely still, his basket on the ground beside him. He looked like a statue, his eyes empty, his face blank. What happened to him? Idara whispered. He gave up, Simi explained. He decided the burden was too heavy and let it fall. Now he's neither here nor there, not living in our world, not free in this one, just existing. A chill ran down Idara's spine. Across the landscape, she now noticed several such figures, all standing motionless, abandoned baskets at their feet. How do you know all this? She asked me. I've been here long enough to watch others come and go. I've seen what happens to those who give up. Simi's voice held a deep sadness. And I've met others who shared what they learned. As they continued walking, Idura felt the weight of her basket shift slightly. Images began to form within it, not visible to the eye, but somehow projected directly into her mind. She saw her father lying paralyzed, her mother weeping, all because of her choice to take the bush path. The basket shows us the consequences of our actions, Simi explained, noting Idura's pained expression. It forces us to see the truth we've been avoiding. Make it stop, Idara pleaded, closing her eyes. But the images continued, now showing all the time she had hurt others with her stubbornness, friends she had betrayed, promises she had broken, pain she had caused. You have to face it, Simi said gently. That's the only way the burden ever lightens. In their small village home, Amma sat by the door, waiting for a daughter who did not return. Dawn broke over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, but bringing no sign of Idara. Neighbors had searched through the night, combing the bush paths and the river's edge, but found nothing except footprints that ended mysteriously in the middle of a path, as if Idara had simply vanished into thin air. She will come home, Amma whispered to herself, clutching her daughter's favorite scarf. She must come home, but deep in her heart, Amma knew that wherever Idara had gone, it was beyond her reach. All she could do now was hope that her stubborn daughter would finally learn to bend before she broke completely. The sun never set in the land of the familiar. Time passed strangely, measured only by footsteps and the gradual shifting of the landscape. Idara had no idea how long she had been walking with Simi. It could have been hours or days. Her neck and shoulders ached from the weight of the invisible basket. Each step required concentration to keep the burden balanced. When her mind wandered to thoughts of home, of her sick father, or worried mother, the basket seemed to grow heavier, as if punishing her for thinking of what she had lost rather than what she had learned. How much longer must we walk? Idara asked, her voice strained with exhaustion. Until you understand, Simi replied simply. She had become a patient teacher, guiding Idara through this strange world with quiet wisdom beyond her years. As they crested a small hill, they spotted a figure ahead, a young boy, perhaps 12 or 13, wearing fine clothes that seemed oddly out of place in this realm. Unlike them, his basket appeared to be physical rather than invisible. It was made of intricately woven gold, glittering in the unchanging light. Who is that? Idara whispered. Someone new, Simi replied. Like you. He must have just arrived. The boy stood in the middle of the path, looking with disgust at the golden basket balanced on his head. As they approached, Idara could hear him muttering angrily to himself. Stupid thing. I don't need this. Do you know who my father is? Hello, Simi called out gently. Are you lost? The boy spun around, nearly losing his balance. His face was handsome, but twisted with arrogance and fear. Who are you? Where am I? I demand you take me back home immediately. His voice cracked with panic beneath the commanding tone. We can't take you back, Idara said, surprised to find herself explaining what Simi had taught her. No one can leave until they've learned their lesson. The boy scoffed. Lesson? What lesson? I've done nothing wrong. I was simply sitting on a chair in my father's garden, and now I'm here. He gestured wildly at the surreal landscape. The chair brought you here because you needed to learn something, Simi explained patiently. We all did. Nonsense. My father will find me. He's the wealthiest merchant in the city. You'll pay whatever ransom you want. Idara and Simi exchanged glances. The boy clearly didn't understand where he was or what was happening. There's no ransom, Idara said. This is the land of the familiar. We're all here because we were too stubborn to listen to those who tried to warn us. The boy's face flushed with anger. I don't need to listen to anyone. I am Kofi, son of Chief Adebayo. I take orders from no one. As the words left his mouth, his golden basket visibly increased in size, causing him to stagger under its new weight. Your basket gets heavier when you refuse to learn, Simi warned. You must be careful with your thoughts and words here. Kofi reached up, trying to push the basket off his head. I don't want this stupid thing. Take it away, don't. Both girls cried out simultaneously, but it was too late. With a final push, Kofi shoved the golden basket off his head. It fell to the ground with a heavy thud that seemed to echo across the entire landscape. For a moment, everything went still. Even the shifting terrain froze in place. Kofi's triumphant smile lasted only seconds before horror dawned on his face. His feet began to sink into the ground, as if the earth had turned to quicksand beneath him. Help me, he screamed, reaching toward them. What's happening? The basket, Simi whispered, her face pale. He dropped his basket. Idara lunged forward, trying to grab Kofi's outstretched hand, but an invisible force held her back. She could only watch as the boy sank deeper, his terrified eyes locked with hers. Please, he begged, now waist deep in the shifting ground. I'll listen. I'll learn. Just help me. From behind them came a soft, raspy chuckle. Adar turned to see an old woman standing on the path, her wrinkled face creased in a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She carried no basket, yet moved with the ease of someone completely unburdened. The boy made his choice, the old woman said, her voice like dry leaves rustling. As we all must. Who are you? Idara demanded, still struggling against the invisible force that prevented her from helping Kofi. The old woman's smile widened. A guide, of sorts. I help those who are tired of their burdens. Simi grabbed Idara's arm, pulling her back. Don't listen to her, she hissed. She's not what she seems. The old woman laughed again. Such suspicion from one so young. I merely offer a choice. These baskets, she gestured toward their heads, are unnecessary. A cruel punishment for simply living as we choose. Liar. Simi's voice rang out with unexpected force. You trick people into dropping their baskets, so they'll be trapped here forever. The old woman's eyes narrowed, her kind demeanor falling away like a discarded mask. Freedom is never a tricked child. These fools. She waved toward Kofi, now sunk to his chest, his cries growing weaker. They choose their fate by refusing to choose freedom. That's not freedom, Idara said, understanding dawning on her. It's a trap. The ground gave one final shudder, and Kofi disappeared completely. Where he had stood, only his golden basket remained, now tarnished and dull. The old woman moved toward it with surprising speed, her fingers curling around its handle. One more for my collection, she murmured, then turned her gaze to Idara and Simi. You'll join him eventually. They all do. With a swirl of her tattered robes, the old woman vanished, taking Kofi's basket with her. The air where she had stood seemed to shimmer briefly, then settled back to normal. Idara felt sick. What was she? Some call her the collector, Simi said quietly. She preys on the newly arrived, those who haven't yet accepted their burdens. She convinces them to drop their baskets, promising freedom. And Kofi? Where did he go? Simi's eyes filled with sadness. Nowhere. Everywhere. Those who drop their baskets become part of this land. Not quite alive, not quite dead. Just here. Forever. A chill ran down Idara's spine. She found herself instinctively reaching up to steady her invisible basket, though her arm still passed through it. We need to keep moving, Simi said, glancing nervously over her shoulder. The collector often returns for those who witnessed her at work. As they hurried away from the spot where Kofi had vanished, Idara noticed her basket had grown even heavier. New images flashed in her mind. Not just her past mistakes now, but Kofi's terrified face as he sank into the earth. Somehow, she felt responsible for his fate too. It wasn't your fault, Simi said, as if reading her thoughts. Each person must make their own choices here. I could have warned him better, Idara insisted. I could have stopped him, perhaps. Or perhaps his stubbornness was too great to overcome, just as yours once was. The words stung, but Idara recognized their truth. She had been just as defiant as Kofi, just as unwilling to listen. The only difference was that she had been lucky enough to meet Simi before encountering the collector. Does your basket ever show you your brother? Idara asked hesitantly, remembering Simi's earlier mention of her tragic past. Simi's steps faltered slightly. Every day, she whispered, his face as the current pulled him under. The way he reached for me, trusting his big sister to save him. I'm sorry, Idara said, meaning it more deeply than ever before. The hardest weights to bear are the ones that can never be put right, Simi replied. Your father's stroke, my brother's death. Some consequences can't be undone, only lived with. For the first time, Idara truly understood the lesson of the baskets. They weren't just punishment, they were truth. The unavoidable reality that actions have consequences that must be carried, acknowledged, and learned from. As this realization settled in her heart, Idara felt her basket shift slightly, the weight redistributing itself more evenly across her shoulders. It was still heavy, but somehow more manageable than before. It got lighter, she said, surprised. Simi smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. That's how it begins. Understanding brings relief, bit by bit. Back in the village, as night fell once more without any sign of Idara, Alma lit a small oil lamp and placed it in the window of their home. It was an old tradition, a light to guide lost loved ones home through the darkness. Akon watched from his sickbed, a single tear rolling down his paralyzed cheek. Neither spoke the fear that had taken root in their hearts, that their daughter was beyond the reach of any earthly light. Still, the flame flickered bravely against the night, a small beacon of hope in a world grown suddenly vast and frightening. The landscape shifted again as Idara and Simi continued their journey. Rolling hills gave way to a dense forest, unlike any Idara had seen in her village. The trees here stood impossibly tall, their trunks wide enough for 10 people to join hands around them. Their leaves shimmered with colors that changed as she watched, green to gold to deep purple, and back again. I'm so tired, Idara admitted, her shoulders aching beneath her invisible burden. Though it had lightened slightly with her new understanding, the basket remained a constant presence, forcing her to stand straight and move carefully. We can rest soon, Simi promised. There's a place ahead where many find comfort. They walked in silence for a while, the only sound their footsteps on the soft forest floor. Idara found her thoughts turning to home, to her father lying paralyzed because of her stubbornness, to her mother waiting by the door. Do you think they're still looking for me? She asked suddenly. Simi didn't need to ask who she meant. Yes, she said softly. Parents never stop looking, even after 3 years. Idara asked, thinking of how long Simi had been here. Even then, Simi's voice held a certainty that brought tears to Idara's eyes. The trees began to thin, and a soft rushing sound reached them through the forest. Ahead, a clearing opened up, and within it, a stream wound its way across their path. The water sparkled with an inner light, creating patterns on the surrounding trees and ground. The reflective stream, Simi announced, her voice hushed with respect. Idara approached cautiously. Unlike ordinary water, this stream seemed to flow with liquid light. Its surface was so smooth it looked like polished glass, yet it moved and rippled like any river. What is it? She asked, kneeling at the edge. A place of truth, Simi replied, staying a few steps back. The stream shows us what we need to see, not what we want to see. Idara leaned forward, peering into the luminous water. At first, she saw only her own reflection, a tired girl with worried eyes and an invisible weight on her head. Then the image began to change. She was looking at her village, but from above, as if floating in the sky. The scene zoomed in on her home, where her mother sat by the door, weaving a basket with trembling hands. Tears streamed down Amma's face as she worked, but she did not pause or wipe them away. Mama, Idara whispered, reaching toward the image. Her fingers touched the water's surface, sending ripples across it. The scene shifted. Now she saw her father, thinner than before, struggling to sit up in his bed. His right side remained limp and useless, but with his left hand, he was attempting to feed himself. The effort cost him dearly. A sweat beaded on his forehead, and frustration clouded his eyes. Yet he persisted, determined to regain some measure of independence. Father, Idara choked out, her chest tight with grief. The stream rippled again, and she saw herself as a small child, throwing a tantrum because her mother wouldn't let her play near the well. She saw herself as a young girl, sneaking out to the market when she was supposed to be helping at home. She saw herself laughing with friends when she should have been caring for her sick grandmother. Each memory flowed into the next, a parade of stubbornness, of willful disobedience, of thinking she knew better than everyone else. Some incidents were small, others significant, but all showed the same pattern. All showed her refusing to listen, refusing to bend. Then came the most painful images. Her father handing her the precious box, his eyes pleading with her to be careful, her decision to take the forbidden path, the thieves surrounding her, her father's face as he realized everything was lost. Stop, she begged the stream. Please stop. But the water showed her more. Her father's stroke, her mother's tears, her own continuing stubbornness despite it all. And finally, the chair on the path, waiting for her like a trap she had set for herself. Idara wept openly now, tears falling into the stream and creating spreading circles of light. She had never truly seen herself before, had never understood the pain her stubborn heart had caused those who loved her. The weight of her basket seemed to double as she confronted these truths, pressing her closer to the ground. I'm sorry, she whispered, not to the stream, but to the parents who couldn't hear her. I'm so sorry for everything. As the words left her lips, the water's surface changed again. Now it showed not the past, but possible futures. Her father growing weaker, her mother aging alone, her own empty place at their table becoming a permanent wound that never healed. It doesn't have to be this way, Simi said quietly, finally approaching the stream's edge. The future isn't fixed. Adara looked up through her tears. How can I change it? I'm trapped here, and even if I could go back, my father's stroke can't be undone. The thieves won't return what they stole. Some consequences can't be changed, Simi agreed. But how you respond to them, that's still your choice. The stream rippled one last time, showing Idara a different future, one where she returned to her village, where she cared for her father with patience and love, where she eased her mother's burden instead of adding to it. In this future, she listened more than she spoke, thought before she acted, and considered others before herself. It wasn't a perfect future. Her father remained partially paralyzed. Their home stayed humble, but there was peace there, and love, and a gentleness in Idar's eyes that had never been there before. Can that really happen? Idar asked, her voice small with hope and doubt. It can, Simi said. If you truly learn the lesson of the basket, Idara stood, wiping her tears away. For the first time since arriving in this strange land, she felt a sense of purpose. The basket still weighed heavily on her head, but now she understood its message. I want to go home, she said firmly. I want to make things right, as much as I can. Look, Simi gasped, pointing. Idara glanced down and saw that the stream had become a perfect mirror again, reflecting only their faces. But something was different. The basket on her head, invisible before, now appeared in the reflection, and it was noticeably smaller than it had been. The burden lightens when understanding is genuine, Simi explained. a smile breaking across her face. Adara reached up, expecting her hand to pass through the basket as it always had. To her surprise, her fingers touched solid woven material. The basket had become physical, tangible, and lighter. What does it mean? She asked, though deep inside, she already knew. It means you're beginning to accept your burden rather than fight against it, Simi replied. It's the first step toward going home. Simi turned to the stream and knelt beside it. As Adora watched, the water showed Simi's own memories. A young girl arguing with her grandmother, sneaking to the river during flood season, a small boy following her despite her grandmother's warnings, the rushing water rising suddenly, the boy's terrified face as the current pulled him under. Tears streamed down Simi's face as she watched, yet she did not turn away. I see this every time I come to this stream, she said softly. I need to remember what my stubbornness cost. Adara knelt beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. Your brother wouldn't want you trapped here forever. I know, Simi whispered. But I haven't found the way out yet. Then we'll look together. Adara decided. There must be a path home for both of us. As they rose to continue their journey, both girls noticed that their baskets had changed. Simi's, like Adara's, had become smaller and more solid. They could now touch them, adjust them, even briefly lift them from their heads for a moment's relief before the invisible force compelled them to replace the burden. They're becoming ours to carry rather than being forced upon us, Simi observed. That's important. In the village, Uma fell asleep by the window, the oil lamp still burning beside her. In her dreams, she saw her daughter walking through a strange forest, carrying a basket on her head. Something about Idara's face was different. There was a softness there, a humility that had never been present before. Come home, Alma whispered in her sleep. Find your way back to us. And somehow, across the vast distance separating them, Idara heard her mother's voice calling her home. After leaving the reflective stream, Idara and Simi walked with lighter steps despite the baskets they carried. The landscape continued to shift around them, but now it seemed less threatening, more like a path unfolding toward some destination rather than an endless wandering. How will we know when it's time to go home? Idara asked as they crested yet another hill. I'm not sure anyone knows, Simi admitted. Those who leave never say goodbye. They simply disappear. The thought made Idara's heart ache. If I find the way out, I'll try to come back for you. Simi smiled sadly. That's not how it works. Each person must find their own path. They walked in companionable silence until the scenery shifted once more. This time, the land before them transformed into a perfect replica of Idara's village stream, the very place she had been heading to meet Deo on the night she encountered the chair. It looks exactly like home, Idara whispered, hurrying forward. The stream glittered in the strange light of this realm, its waters clear and inviting. Along its banks grew familiar plants and trees, the same ones Idara had seen all her life. Be careful, Simi warned. The land sometimes creates these familiar places to test us. But Idara barely heard her. Something about this stream called to her, pulling her forward with an invisible force as strong as the one that had first drawn her to the chair. She approached the water's edge and knelt down, touching its surface gently. The moment her fingers met the cool water, the stream's surface changed. Like the reflective stream before it, this water became a mirror, but what it showed was different. Instead of memories or possible futures, Idara saw herself as she truly was in this moment, a girl who had made terrible mistakes, but who now understood their cost. A girl who carried her burden, not with resentment, but with acceptance. Tears welled in her eyes and fell into the water, creating ripples that spread across the surface. As each tear touched the stream, Idara felt her basket grow lighter until it seemed to weigh almost nothing at all. Simi, look, she gasped, reaching up to touch her basket. To her amazement, the basket wasn't just lighter, it was fading, becoming transparent like morning mist under the sun's rays. Simi watched with wide eyes. Idara, I think. I think it's time. Time for what? For you to go home. A strange tingling sensation spread through Idora's body. She looked down and saw that her hands had taken on the same translucent quality as her basket. What's happening to me? She asked, panic edging into her voice. You're leaving, Simi said, smiling through her tears. You've learned what you needed to learn. Idora reached for her friend, but her hands passed through Simi's arms as if neither of them were fully solid. Come with me. You've learned too. I can see your basket is lighter. Simi shook her head. My time isn't yet. There are still things I need to understand. But how will I find my way? What do I do? Trust, Simi said simply. Let go of your fear, your stubbornness, your need to control. Just let go. The world around Idara began to blur and spin. The last thing she saw was Simi standing beside the stream, her hand raised in farewell, a bittersweet smile on her face. Remember what you learned. Simi's voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Remember. Then everything went white. Idara opened her eyes to find herself standing beside the village stream, exactly where she had been heading the night she sat on the strange chair. The full moon hung overhead, casting silver light across the water. For a moment, she wondered if she had dreamed the entire experience. The chair, the land of the familiar, Simi. But when she reached up, she felt a subtle weight on her head, like the memory of a burden rather than the burden itself. Not a physical basket anymore, but the knowledge it represented, the understanding that her actions affected others, that listening was not weakness but wisdom. A rustling in the bushes startled her. Turning quickly, she saw a figure emerge from the shadows. Deo, the boy she had been so eager to meet. But he wasn't alone. A girl from the neighboring village clung to his arm, giggling as they approached the stream. They hadn't noticed Idora yet, standing still in the moonlight. What about that other girl? Idora, the girl was asking. I heard she disappeared. Deo shrugged carelessly. Who cares? She was too stubborn anyway, always thinking she knew better than everyone else. You're much prettier, the word stung, but not as deeply as they once would have. Idora saw Deo clearly now, not the wonderful boy she had imagined, but a shallow young man who had moved on to another girl the moment she was gone. Stepping out of the shadows, Idora cleared her throat. The couple jumped in surprise, the girl shrieking slightly. Idara, Deo's face paled as if he'd seen a ghost. Where have you been? Everyone's been looking for you. I got lost, she said simply, not bothering to explain further. I'm going home now. She turned away from his stammered excuses, feeling strangely light. The boy she had risked everything to meet now seemed so unimportant compared to the family waiting for her. The path home was familiar yet different, as if she were seeing it through new eyes. Each step brought a rush of memories, both from her life before and from her time in the land of the familiar. Simi's face remained clear in her mind, and Idura silently promised to live in a way that would honor her friend's teachings. As she approached her family's home, Idura saw the small oil lamp still burning in the window. Her mother had kept a light for her, hoping against hope that her daughter would return. Taking a deep breath, Idara knocked softly on the door. There was a moment of stillness, then hurried footsteps. The door flew open, and there stood Amma, her eyes wide with disbelief. Idara, she whispered, reaching out a trembling hand to touch her daughter's face. Is it really you? It's me, Mama, Idara said, tears flowing freely down her cheeks. I'm home. Amma pulled her into a fierce embrace, sobbing against her hair. My child, my stubborn child. Where have you been? We thought we'd lost you forever. I was lost, Idara admitted, holding her mother tightly. But I found my way back. When they finally separated, Idara looked past her mother anxiously. Father, how is he? Alma's face fell, and Adara felt a cold dread spread through her chest. Your father. He took a turn for the worse after you disappeared. The healers did what they could, but Alma's voice broke. No, Idara whispered, pushing past her mother into the house. No, please, no. The small room was dark, except for the light from a single candle. On the sleeping mat where her father had lain for weeks lay a still form covered with a cloth. Idar fell to her knees beside him, her body shaking with sobs. Father, father, I'm home. I'm back. Please. But Ekon could not hear her. Sometime during her absence, while she learned her difficult lessons in the land of the familiar, her father had slipped away. The final consequence of her stubbornness was one she could never undo. Gently, she pulled back the cloth to see his face. He looked peaceful, the lines of pain and frustration smoothed away. With trembling fingers, she touched his cold cheek. I'm sorry, she whispered. I should have listened. I should have been here. Amma knelt beside her, placing an arm around her shoulders. He waited as long as he could, she said softly. He believed you would return. When? Idara asked, her voice breaking. When did he? 3 days ago. Amma replied. The village has been preparing for his burial tomorrow. 3 days. Idara had been gone much longer than a single night. Time in the land of the familiar had moved differently, just as Simi had said. I should have been here, she repeated, the weight of her invisible basket suddenly heavy again on her head. You're here now, Amma said, wiping away her own tears. And you're changed. I can see it in your eyes. It was true. Something fundamental had shifted within Idara during her time away. The stubborn girl who had left this house was not the same one who had returned. That night, Idara sat vigil beside her father's body, telling him everything that had happened, everything she had learned. She knew he couldn't hear her, but somehow it felt right to share her journey with him. I will make you proud, she promised as dawn broke through the small window. I will be the daughter you always hoped I would be. The days that followed were difficult, but healing. The village gathered to bury Ikon with honor, many expressing surprise at Idara's return and the change in her demeanor. Where once she had been argumentative and dismissive, she now listened carefully to the elders' words, helped without being asked, and cared for her grieving mother with gentle patience. Some whispered that her disappearance had been the work of spirits teaching her a lesson. Idara neither confirmed nor denied these rumors. The truth of the land of the familiar, of Simi and the baskets and the reflective stream, remained her secret. Weeks passed, then months. The small home that had once felt confining to Idara now became a sanctuary where she and her mother rebuilt their lives together. With the savings gone, they worked harder than ever. Alma weaving her renowned baskets, Idara learning to farm the small plot of land behind their home. It wasn't the life Idara had imagined for herself, but she embraced it with a grateful heart. Each night before sleeping, she would touch the spot on her head where the invisible basket had rested, reminding herself of its lessons. Sometimes in her dreams, she returned to the land of the familiar. She would walk with Simi beside the reflective stream, their baskets growing lighter with each step. She always asked if Simi had found her way home yet, and always woke before hearing the answer. 1 year after her return, on the anniversary of her father's death, Idara visited his grave alone. She placed fresh flowers on the mound and sat beside it in the fading evening light. I hope you can see me, Father, she said softly. I hope you know how sorry I am and how hard I'm trying to be better. As she spoke, a strange sensation came over her, a warmth that spread from the top of her head down through her body. For just a moment, she felt the weight of the basket again, but instead of pressing down, it seemed to lift away completely. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the nearby trees, and in it, Idara thought she heard a familiar voice. Remember what you learned. She smiled through her tears, whispering back, I remember, see me. I promise I remember. On her way home, Idura passed the path that led to the bush where she had once found the strange chair. She paused, considering, then deliberately turned away. Some paths did not need to be traveled twice. Some lessons, once learned, remained in the heart forever. The sun set behind her as she walked toward home, where her mother waited with a lamp in the window. The weight of her past remained with her, not as a burden now, but as wisdom hard won and precious. And somewhere, in a land beyond ordinary understanding, a girl named Simi felt her own basket grow lighter, knowing that her friend had found her way home at last.